Evolutionary Theory and Psychology, Charles Darwin, Part 1. Professor Michael Botwin, Department of Psychology, California State University, Fresno. Charles Darwin was born in Shrewsbury, England, and grew up there, which was kind of in the country. He went to the local school and eventually had to board there. He did not like that at all. It sounds like a pretty bleak school from the descriptions. Darwin was a very smart man and never let his formal education get in the way of his learning. He always was interested in nature and collecting specimens and things like that. He and his brother would range all over the place to collect specimens as kids and continue doing so together as adults. He followed his brother to Edinburgh to study medicine, but he found medicine to be an extremely nasty business. To remember, this is pre-anesthesia medicine, and the blood and the carnage associated with that era of medicine really turned off Darwin from pursuing a medical degree as his father and grandfather had. Well, his father was looking for something for him to do, and eventually he went to Cambridge, where he studied theology of all things. Wasn't particularly keen on that either, but he continued talking with the naturalist, and he made friends with people that liked to collect things and hang out in nature. If you read accounts of the years that Darwin spent at Cambridge, his set of rooms, I imagine if you live in a dorm room, having rooms at a college sounds extremely pretentious, and it probably was, were full of stuffed animals, specimens, guns, and all the necessarily accoutrements to do that kind of work. Well, Darwin graduated, and it was kind of typical for a young man who graduated college at the time to travel and see the world after he's received his formal education. So he was able to get through some connections, an invitation to travel on the Beagle and be Captain Fitzroy's gentleman companion. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a bit. Let's just finish this basic biography. He spends 5 years out at sea on the Beagle, 1831 to 36. Comes back, starts writing up some of his findings, some of his specimens, collections, that, and being a very well-connected upper crust English type guy, got him elected to the Royal Society. But he sat around a long time, till 1859, before Origin of Species was published, and that's part of this lecture, the story of him publishing Origins. He died in 1882 and is buried in Scientist Corner with Newton and other noted scholars in Westminster Abbey. So Darwin wangled an invitation onto the Beagle as a gentleman companion. Now, most people mistakenly believe that Charles Darwin was the official ship's naturalist of the Beagle. He wasn't. There was a British naval officer assigned to that task. But Darwin kind of took it over. Darwin was there for some interesting reasons. One main reason was that British sea captains were not allowed to socialize with their crews. You can imagine being gone 5 years from home, many of them out at sea, and you can't hang out and socialize with anybody. The British Navy was finding that there was an unusually large number of individuals who were going stark raving mad as British sea captains because you couldn't socialize with anyone. There was the old Russell Crowe movie out many years ago called Master and Commander, which kind of epitomizes the role of a British naval sea captain. Literally, the captain had the power of life over death. He could send you to places that most likely would kill you. Hence, he didn't want to get to know the crew too well. It was the kind of social compact in the British Navy. British sea captains took their wives with them. That was kind of frowned upon because it was extremely dangerous to travel on an ocean-going sailing ship at the time. So Darwin agreed to go and be Captain Fitzroy's gentleman companion, which basically meant he wasn't part of the crew, so Fitzroy could talk to him and socialize and have meals and stuff with him. Well, that would have been all well and good, but Fitzroy and Darwin had a falling out about 3 months out at sea. Darwin continued to be his own naturalist, but he hung out with the officers of the ship rather than with the captain. Now you can see the long trip of the Beagle on this slide. Leaves England, hops down the South American coast, comes back up, goes to the Galapagos, crosses over to Australia and some of the Pacific Islands, stops at Africa, back to South America, picking up the trade winds and heading back home to England. 5 years out. Darwin found many interesting specimens during his trip, and most people only think about the Galapagos, but he had hundreds of samples and specimens from South America, things that just weren't existing on the European continent. Well, everybody knows that Darwin got to the Galapagos, and he was amazed with the diversity of life he saw on the Galapagos Islands. Now, he'd actually been thinking about these things for a long time before that, and until he published a long time after that. But the trip to the Galapagos is always acknowledged as one of those major epiphanies for Darwin. There were many unusual creatures, including these lizards, which nearly went extinct. The Beagle didn't stop at the Galapagos Islands because it had cool animals. It stopped at the Galapagos Islands to reprovision, to get food, to get fresh water. The diet of the average British sailor on a 19th century sailing ship was absolutely horrible. Much of the prepackaged food that was sent in barrels became infested with vermin and things like that. So any chance that they could get to lay their hands on some fresh food, they would do it. And sailing ships started to stop at the Galapagos. Visit was he found that these particular lizards, here's another picture of that lizard, were all over the island. And since they had never encountered humans, they weren't worried about them. And the sailors found them very easy game. And they would club them and roast them and eat them. If you'd been living on what they were feeding British sailors during that time, lizard would probably sound pretty good to you. Darwin noticed some other interesting animals on the Galapagos. This is one of my favorite. I think it just went extinct, the species. They're called saddleback turtles. Notice the back of the shell is kind of arrayed up to make the back of the turtle look like a saddle. This adaptation is so that the turtle can reach up and get higher vegetation. Now it's called the saddleback turtle, but I like to colloquially call it the giraffe turtle since it's got a long neck and it reaches up. What most people talk about with Darwin, though, are the finches that he found on the different islands. Came to the conclusion that they all started from the same few birds that came over from the South American continent and made their home. And as they spread out in the environmental niches of the Galapagos over succeeding generations, they became specialized to live in their environment. And so you see some examples of the same line of finches, but they all have, in this slide, different beaks, whether it's to break seeds, almost surgically remove things from a piece of fruit, get insects out of a tree, or to eat the leaves of a tree and become kind of vegetarian. Darwin noticed many different forms of finches in different environmental niches of the Galapagos. Here is kind of a little family tree. You certainly don't have to memorize it. So Darwin completed his journey, comes back home to be a gentleman farmer, eventually marries, starts having kids, and starts taking his role as kind of a gentleman farmer, typical member of the English aristocracy. Now Darwin, being ever curious, started to also notice some man-made variations. For example, pigeons. All of these different fancy pigeons were bred from the original pigeon that's just the plain old everyday gray bird. Some people call them flying rats. I kind of like pigeons. I don't give them that moniker. But you can see that if you select certain characteristics, you can get an amazingly different array of pigeons, most of which could not survive in the natural environment. So he was noticing selection, both artificial and natural. And he used his knowledge of artificial selection to look at other issues. So look at this weed. Doesn't look very appetizing, does it? Well, over time, that weed has been crossbred, selectively bred. You get all of these different vegetables which don't exist in the natural environment, but are totally the creation of humans through artificial selection. Also, if you look at other species, for example, like dogs, we know that all domesticated dogs came from wolves originally. There are lots of dog food commercials on telling us that constantly. If you look at the amazingly large range of dogs from Chihuahuas to Great Danes, they all originally started from wolves. So you have extreme artificial selection. Here is a slide from a biology textbook that basically talks about our pesticide use. Generally, even though a pesticide may kill most of the members of a parasite family, you'll get a couple that are parasite resistant and they will breed, and in turn they will breed a pesticide resistant bug, which is happening in agriculture today. Same thing is happening with even smaller critters like bacteria. Our current antibiotics aren't working because we've bred super duper bacteria that our current antibiotics cannot destroy. And doctors are currently very concerned about the superbugs that are coming online. And it's all through our selection as humans by overusing antibiotics both in the food supply and the medical world. Well, Darwin got his first bones doing barnacles and studying barnacles. Rebecca Stout's got a very cool book called Darwin and the Barnacle. Here is a page from Darwin's Barnacle book and the spine of it. If you're ever at the British Museum, and I know you might just be around the corner there and want to stop by, Darwin's barnacle specimens that he collected over the years are still on display in the British Museum. That's a little bit of Darwin's personal background, kind of what he was seeing in the world to come to these ideas that eventually are going to be called evolution. In our next unit, we'll specifically get into the formal introduction of the theory of evolution by natural selection into the scientific world. See you then. This has been a We Have Couches video production. Copyright 2020, Professor Michael Botwin. All rights reserved.